This is what I'm going to look at. I'm going to look at the key points of culture, time as a cultural issue, communication, again, as a cultural issue, a little bit about humor, and also a bit about hierarchy, because this is something which people find very confusing in the UK. As I said earlier, we all think we're normal, and sitting there on the bench, you have the two 90-year-olds at their end of their life, and one says to the other, Joe, everyone's strange except you and me, and even you are strange sometimes. So just keep in mind, you'll always think your way of doing things is okay, normal, not from arrogance, but because in your adult life, in your professional life, it has been successful. This is a definition of culture that I thought you might like: the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes the members of one category of people from another. Those of you who have young children, think how much your children learn about your culture from when they are very, very small. And there are lots of examples of this, of how children start to behave to fit the culture they belong to. Think back to your childhood. Some of the things you were taught about good behavior was very direct. Eating is one of these things. We all, with children, stop them putting their entire head in a bowl. But lots of cultural things we learn are very indirect. So the key points of a culture is learnt in very small increments. That's why it's difficult to relearn. That's why it's difficult when you come to a new country to learn all about the culture, because there are subtle things. It's, of course, shared between numerous groups. It differs, but it passes between generation. And I think generation is very key. Think of how much comes from different generations. And then in the UK, as in all countries, there is a difference in behavior depending on generation. For a lot of you, probably the older somebody is, the easier they will be to understand, and in all ways. The UK in 2025 is not the same as the UK in 2015. Things move. There are changes all the time. As well as thinking about the UK in this case, you can't just think about one generic culture. You also need to think about the different cultural groups which exist. So, class, this is in alphabetical order. Class is not at the top because we're in the UK, it's in alphabetical order. And the photograph there is a very famous photo. It was taken 100 years ago, a little bit more, and it shows some boys at a public school, which is the elite part of the private school system, and some boys from a state school on the other side. It's a very famous picture. Ethnicity is key. Gender, of course, is a factor. Generation, as I've mentioned. Language, what is their mother tongue? Do they have more than one language? Nation, in the case of the UK, you will have discovered, I think, there is a difference, a very obvious difference in behaviour between Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland. Culturally different. Organisation, who do they work for? It's a big difference between someone who's spent all their working life, for example, the NHS, and somebody who's worked in small private companies. Region and religion. These are in alphabetical order, not in an order of importance. So this list is key for any culture you're dealing with. Anyone you're dealing with, think through this and think, how much of this information do you know? And then how can you subtly alter your behavior? Because you do this automatically with your own culture. You communicate in a different way, you behave in a different way, depending who you're with. The easiest one to think about is generation. Most people behave differently with somebody much older. So another way you can do this when you're dealing with different cultures is think to yourself 3 questions. The first one is, how were they educated? This is not what, because if you're in a hospital, most people have got medical education. It's how. What is the style of education? Because then when you're working with them, you'll know much more. How are they comfortable at handling explanations? How will they ask questions? What will they do if they don't understand? This is a very key cultural difference globally. If somebody doesn't understand, will they stay quiet, or will they immediately say, can you repeat that? Can you go through that again? Second question is, what stories did their grandparents tell them? This is very useful for understanding somebody, where they're fitting in history culturally. And the third question, what are the authorities they consult mentally before making a decision? So before making an important decision, what do they think about? In what order and to what percentage? Do they think about family, law, their professional reputation, religion, police? What are the different things they think about? So thinking of those 3 questions together, whichever culture you're dealing with, you will more easily then know the best way to interact with them, whether you're working with them as a colleague or whether they're a patient. Any questions so far?
All good, Carolyn.
All right, so then time. Can you see the picture okay? Yeah?
Yeah.
I think the only sort of time that is completely universal throughout all cultures in any part of the world is something like this. This is seed to plant, back to seed again. That sort of image or thought process is in all of us, in all cultures. Other than that, time is very different culturally. And time is very important in the UK, because in the UK, we use somebody's attitude as time almost as a way of judging them. Being very, very punctual, being very time observant is considered a positive, almost to the point that it excuses other things. And this is because in the UK, time is considered a personal commodity. I'll explain more about that. So 2 sorts of ways of thinking about time globally. Either time is a series of passing events. So there's some sort of linear quality here. People who culturally fit here think about time past, present, future, or past, present, future. They move their hands or they look behind them. This sort of time, people feel that time can be very controlled and they feel they own it. So your time, my time, holiday time, it feels like a commodity. And therefore, punctuality is very key because it's a way of showing respect, understanding of other people's time. So in the UK in general, if somebody, for example, is late to a meeting, they would do 2 things. They would apologize and they would give an explanation. Whereas the other way of thinking about time is that past, present, and future are completely interrelated. So here there's no linear quality. Time exists, but we cannot take it and own it. it's a commodity perhaps for everybody. It's a different way of thinking about it. Good example here is the difference between the UK and France. France, as you know, is very near to the UK geographically. You can swim from England to France if you want to. I don't recommend it. But for the French, if somebody British arrives late to a meeting and immediately not only apologizes, but gives an explanation, for example, I'm so sorry I'm late, but the train was delayed because there was a signal failure, and then they give an explanation. To somebody French, the feeling is, we hadn't noticed you when you had not arrived, and now you're taking more time giving your explanation. Reverse that example, when somebody French arrives late to a meeting and doesn't apologize, to the British way of thinking, it's impolite. It has not, all these people are very polite, I would say. It's just cultural. It's a difference in how we handle things. So once you're working in the UK, it's not just punctuality that's expected, it's predicting any lateness. So predicting lateness on meeting a deadline, predicting quite a long way in advance, is considered the polite thing to do. Coupled with this, then, are ways of speaking. This has nothing to do with the language you're speaking. This has to do with cultural communication. So I'm going to split it into 3 different ways of communicating. First one, first person speaks, then there's silence, then the second person speaks, then there's silence, then the first person speaks again. That's one model. So it's speech, silence, silence. Second one, first person, immediately the second person, and immediately the first person again. Here they come. So in this model, it's speech, speech, speech. The third one, first person, second person begins before the first person has stopped. And again, there's overlap. Now, I would argue that all these ways of speaking are correct. They're correct, they're efficient, they're polite, however you want to describe it. They don't work well when they come together, because the people who are sitting in the top model want to speak when there's a pause. So they're waiting for the silence, or they're waiting for somebody to give them the silence by asking them to speak. Second group of people, the way they speak is they predict the pause. They know a pause is coming. They know it's coming. They can tell it's coming by what someone is saying. It's coming, it's coming. Can I add something? And then the third group of people, when they want to speak, they speak, because the feeling there is that communication is about sharing. And so if somebody's speaking, you join in. It's opera, if you like. So each method is fine, but when they come together, what happens is the group at the top never speak and are potentially viewed as not good team players, or not interested, or not understanding. The group at the bottom, the third group, tend to dominate and are seen by some of the others as not disciplined, overexcited, all these sorts of descriptions. The group in the middle also tend to dominate because they know how to interrupt at a pause. So if culturally you feel comfortable in the top group, for the UK, you need to move down a bit. You need to slide just and change a little bit, because otherwise you will be perceived in a different way. Is that one clear? I hope so. As well with communication, and again, very key for the UK, because in that last slide, the UK is very much the middle one. unless it's a very social situation or unless people are debating when it moves down the model. Small talk, again, culturally, we're divided. So in some cultures, there is very little small talk, whereas in others, there is a lot. Small talk is not very necessary. It's usually not personal. If you come from a culture which is much more communicative, shares information, wants to talk about the weekend and so on, the UK can seem cold and not friendly. It's not. It's just that that is not seen as necessary. How you can encourage small talk is using certain topics. And these topics for the UK are a good cultural fit. The first one is the weather. The weather is a very good topic because it's not political, it's not personal, and it often changes. Another useful topic is sport. Even if you're not interested in sport, it's very useful to follow different sports. It's a good way to initiate conversation. And again, it's not political. It can be, people can be very passionate about it, but it's not political. Then the other things which are really easy to talk about, I think, in the UK is anything local news. So if there have been roadworks or if there's a new car park somewhere, things like that, which everyone has the same knowledge of. And again, it's not personal. So this sort of conversation then may lead to personal information, but it's a more gentle way in for the British culture. It's what most British people are comfortable with. If you're finding it difficult to get somebody to talk, use open questions. Again, the first one is about the weather. What sort of summer do you think we will have this year? You just change that depending on the season. Everyone will have an opinion of this, and it's a good way to start conversation if you don't really know how to introduce yourself. These sort of questions as well are really vital when you're in a different country, because people can become accustomed to your accent, your way of speaking, and you can become accustomed to theirs on information that is not vital. Couple more. What sort of journey did you have? Do you have any pets? These sort of questions you can use for a lot of different people. Are there any markets for local produce? And what could I see locally sports-wise? Again, everyone will have an answer. You don't need to follow through on that. But it's making these connections with British people in an easy way. One thing that comes across a lot is that people now in 2025 are very hesitant to tell somebody that they don't understand them. They feel that they shouldn't have that lack of understanding. So make sure always that people understand you. And if you are not feeling perhaps comfortable in a situation or confident, it's very easy to speak very, very quickly. So in general, I say to anybody who's moved into a new culture, slow down. But the way you do it is you don't slow down like a car, because what happens if you slow down is that you go into a monotone and you will sound boring. What you do is every time you pause, you make the pause a little bit longer. So you lengthen the pause. So overall, you have slowed, but it's in a very natural way. For example, good morning, and then you pause. I'm going to explain 3 things, and then you pause. So you make that pausing place longer. Check with people. Am I speaking loudly enough? Do you want me to write it down? Shall I go through that again? Because people will, in the British culture will find it much easier to say yes than to ask the question themselves. And here, in every culture, in every country in the world, you find some people who are not pleasant, who are difficult. That's something separate. But here, this is understanding the culture. And to be asked something fits very nicely with the British culture. This is thinking about colleagues, because the British don't find it as easy to make greetings. Years ago, the greeting when you met somebody was nice to meet you. And the response always was nice to meet you too. Even before that, the greeting was how do you do? And the response was how do you do? Those have to an extent gone. Now the greeting often is how are you? And the only response to that is fine, thank you, and you. So even if you have one arm in plaster, a big bandage around your head, the response to how are you is still fine. And it's seen much more as a greeting. There are other questions like how are you all right? That isn't even a question. It's become a greeting. They're not expecting you to answer. So your colleagues will not be as good at the initial parts of conversation. So they may not greet you formally in the corridor. They may not say good morning or how was your weekend or are you having a good day? How's your week going? They may not do that. They may not ask about your family ever. This doesn't indicate they're not interested. It indicates part of the British culture, which is quite separate. Work and personal life are often separate. Families are separate from each other. However, your colleagues may be very interested to discuss politics with you, to debate with you, or to know your favorite poet. And a lot of people are confused by this because it's almost a contradiction. But these are the areas that the British are more comfortable with. Feedback, any sort of feedback, again, is difficult to get in the British culture because most of the feedback you get will be very, very indirect. It will not be direct. You can get feedback from your colleagues, but you will have to find it. It's a bit like a maze. Because the style of communication that is considered polite in a lot of cases in the UK is a very indirect style. And that, if you've moved from another country, can be difficult to interpret. For example, if I said to you, I'm trying to think of a good example that's medical. If I was talking to you about a mutual colleague and I said to you, I don't think he's entirely comfortable in his job, do you interpret that as neutral, negative, or very negative?
I would say it still sounded a bit negative.
Only a bit, though.
I've heard worse things.
Yeah. A lot of the time that it is definitely negative, and it can, depending who says it and who they say it about, it can be very negative. Almost means they need to move, they need to leave, because it's that indirect style. I remember somebody I giving the example a long time ago of, they asked, after they'd been in a new job for about 8 weeks, they asked their line manager, how am I doing? Because they hadn't had any feedback and they wanted to know. And the response was from the line manager was, well, you've not killed anybody yet. Which they were quite surprised by, because what they were expecting And what would have happened in their culture was a few sentences of feedback. Well, you've done this very well, and you seem to be learning this, and some information. The British use humour in that case. Also with that, your colleagues and your neighbours in the UK in general will want to help you, but you'll have to ask for it. They probably won't offer it. There's a massive cultural difference here in different parts of the world, and in general, the British don't offer it. Okay, so humour is the next thing, because humour in the UK is a very key part of communication. Yes, there are comedians and there are comedy programs. I'm not thinking about that for this. I'm thinking about how humour is used in the workplace, in social relationships, as a communication tool. And culturally in the UK, you need to understand how humour is used, because humour is not just used for jokes, but it's used to ease communication. It's used to solve issues, and it's used to strengthen relationships. So it's a way that people come closer. So the humour is not really there to be funny, it's there to improve things. And that if you come from a culture where humour is not used in that way, it can seem very confusing. If somebody uses humour with you, it's always, well, very nearly always, a very positive sign, because they feel that you've settled in, you've adjusted, and so on. Another thing I wanted to touch on briefly, because it's very important in my experience for a lot of people coming to the UK. The difference in hierarchy worldwide is enormous. Is there a very complicated hierarchy? Are you always in any situation clear about who you are responsible for and who is responsible for you? And is there a really clear chain of command, or are things much flatter? Is there much more collaboration and teamwork and consensus, perhaps? This changes hugely. What's difficult in the UK is that most of the time the UK looks as if the hierarchy is very flat. Looks like it's very team-based, there's a lot of collaboration. But in fact, behind that is a hierarchy. So a democratic process is that you're including everybody, whereas if it's hierarchical, it is all coming from the top. So the UK, a lot of the time, is very democratic. It looks very democratic. People are asked their opinions and so on. But behind it all, as a shadow, there is a hierarchy. And this can be difficult to interpret. You've got to be aware that that could happen. Okay, we're coming near to the end. So are there any questions about anything to do with the British culture? And I am British, but you can ask anything. You won't offend me, I promise. Or surprise me, probably.
Thank you, Carolyn. I mean, most of the things that you've told me, I think I have experienced or learned in my journey in the past 4.5 years. So, I mean, yeah, just people greeting you to, saying you okay and moving on to talking about weather, not talking about politics, not talking about religion, being very, very, as you say, formal in terms of, having their work life separate and personal life separate. Like it has happened to me a couple of times. Once I was going with my daughter, and I'm in a car, and the car which stops next to me, I can see one of the hospital colleagues in it. Yes, I'm not friends with them, but you work daily with them. So I just wave a hand at them, expecting they might wave a hand at me in return. but I'm not in the hospital. This is not the hospital premises. I'm not working there as a doctor no more. They did not even blink at me and just moved on. To me it was rude, but the worst thing I would say, my daughter was laughing all her guts out, because she felt, oh papa, look, she didn't even recognize you. So that's when I realized, okay, I mean, here the system's a bit different, because back home I would say your work colleagues still used to be your friends. You would become good friends. Unfortunately in the UK, I can't say that, I've got a work colleague who's very, very, or extremely good friend of mine. I can share uh, all the stuff and everything. But yeah, I think that's a bit of a difference. When you talked about hierarchy, absolutely, when I initially came, I was working in a very, very layered system of hierarchy. So it was very, very clear. I'm a doctor. If I've said so, things should be getting done. I shouldn't be questioned. I shouldn't be quizzed, challenged whatsoever. Here,
Mhm.
every day there is a what to say, survival struggle. Essentially, you're still, I would say, bombarded with so many stuff. Why didn't you do this? Everyone's coming. Now it feels fine because you've been in the system for long. But in the initial, and you feel like, oh, what have I done, man? Why did I even move here?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. It's because it's something nobody warns you about that. And when you come to another new country, the weather will be different, the food will be different, the transport will be different, but the culture is difficult, because there are all these issues.
Absolutely. And one thing I particularly loved in your presentation, Carolyn, about help, the same thing, because initially I thought, if you're in trouble, people would help you. I mean, if, for instance, someone's fallen off, someone's missing something. But yeah, my take home is, unless you ask for it, you are not going to get it. So that's what, I try to do on my channel whenever I get a chance. I tell people, if you're not asking for help or anything that you need, you are not going to get it by default.
Yes, you're correct. And people, it's not because they don't want to help. It's because, well, in your case, someone, you're a young professional, you're a doctor. People worry about being patronizing. So they don't ask because they're not comfortable in asking. But if you ask, then it's different. Um,
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
again, if we had somebody British here, they would not agree with all of this because they would say we're very helpful. But on a world scale, they're not. it's these are the differences.
They're helpful, but in a different way. As I said, you have to ask for it. As simple as that. Okay, so Carolyn, to wrap things up, and for people, because we'll be posting this on the social media, and to wrap things up, what would be your take-home points for any international person from anywhere in the globe who's coming to the UK? How can they blend in a bit more quicker? What should they absorb, and how to give back and forth to the culture? What would your take on that be?
Oh, that's a big question. I think expect the positive, because in general, if you're expecting the positive, you're more likely to get something positive. The other thing I would say is take in every piece of information you see, everything you observe, store it, because that's giving you the puzzle, um, and the answer to the puzzle of who are the British.
Absolutely.
Does that answer your question okay?
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, when as a doctor, or any profession, whatever theory you learn and then you start using them into practicality. I think it's same with the British culture. You absorb everything, reciprocate, reflect, and then start practicing them in your culture,
Yes,
and
yes.
essentially bring in the change that's needed in you.
But and talk to everybody. Even if I don't know if you're traveling to work on a bus, talk to the driver. Or just say, "Are you having a good day?" Because then you'll start to feel part of the UK. You'll think, okay, I am interacting, even if often it will be about the weather, but that's fine. You'll get good at that.
I also feel, Carolyn, when people talk about the EDI, the equality, diversity, and inclusion,
Mm.
people make those decisions sitting in the office, and it's never passed on to the people who actually work on the ground force. So I think this is what to say, should be a stepping stone in everyone who's trying to come and work here. And I also feel, because we've come to this nation, we should absorb the culture and try to bring in changes rather than change everything up. And that's what I think can cause a friction at times. But I think you've very, very nicely streamlined all those points that the people who want to come and work here in the UK would be using, and that would be really, really great. So anyone, if you've got any further questions, please go ahead. Else, we'll just do the wrapping comments and we'll see you in the next video. Okay, fine. No worries, Carolyn. So you could go ahead and just do the wrapping thing, and yeah, we will
Okay.
conclude the session there.
The last thing I think I would say is that for a lot of you moving to the UK, and it depends where you are, but if you're in somewhere near a big city, which probably you will be, remember that a lot of people will not know that you have just arrived, because we're a very diverse community in the UK. So even if you said, I've just moved to this hospital, for example, people may think, oh, you've moved internationally, but they may think you've moved from another hospital. And therefore, in some ways, that's good because you're not being treated as the new person. But in some ways, it can make it more difficult because they're going to possibly not offer you any help because they'll think you're fine. So I think I would say that above everything else, just do ask for things and adapt. But also, if somebody makes you feel uncomfortable or is rude, don't necessarily put it down to culture. Please, based on today's session, don't forgive people everything, because there is a line. And if somebody does something that is not right, don't stand for it. Don't think, oh, did I not behave in the way that was... It's something to always think about the cultural differences. But as I do, everywhere in every country, there are some people who are not nice. I hope you don't meet any of them in the UK.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. So ladies and gentlemen, that was Carolyn Gregory from Intercultural Success. You can go and have a look at her website, and she has been absolutely doing this great stuff for so many years now. So thank you so much, Carolyn, for giving your valuable time coming on to the platform and trying to enlighten this for so many people who've got zero idea about this, but equally they're very, very shy and hesitant to talk about this. So I hope this reaches them and they can be a bit more talkative, talk about the weather, do the small talks, and feel included rather than feeling isolated and absolutely alone. Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me, Aman.
Thank you so much. All right, guys, we'll see you in the next video. Keep sharing,
Thank you.
liking, and
Thank
commenting.
you, Carolyn. Thank
Bye.
you, Aman, for